everybody in our different space. Let me talk for just a moment about how we got to where we're going to go today. So in a sense, so far in this course, I've been discussing what you might see as kind of a sweeping struggle of sorts about how democratic the United States was going to be. So I talked about the American Revolution and how that left Americans with a sense of ownership over the fate of the nation, and how their engagement in the revolution taught them a new kind of engagement with public affairs and a sense of entitlement to really engage in those public affairs. So in essence, we saw the whisper of a sense of democratic ideas about the masses, the people, having some ongoing involvement in politics beyond voting. I also talked about how the Declaration of Independence put some of those ideas and ideals in writing in the preamble, not in a way that made the nation instantly democratic, but by putting those ideals in writing, it really gave them endurance and meaning, enabling marginalized people in the future to use those words and those principles to demand their due rights. I talked about the 1780s, when people were experiencing and experimenting with new ideas about nationhood and rights that were fostered during the Revolution, and I talked about how some of those ideas erupted in rebellions and even with parts of states deciding to declare their own independence. I then talked about the Constitution as an attempt to address what some people saw as disorder in the 1780s, and so they sought to create a new, stronger national government, and what they created was really a basic framework of a government. I think, as I mentioned at the time, our Constitution is very short considering all that it does. It's a framework, and people assumed that the national government, the entire government, when it went into effect, would flesh out the reality of that government. And I talked about how the Constitution was grounded on checks and balances and limiting the distribution of power. And I briefly talked about how our political process, our constitutionally determined political process, is supposed to be our anchor in trying times. Then last week, I talked about the 1790s. And first I talked about the early 1790s when people were trying to figure out how a democratic republic would work, trying to determine some kind of new logic and style of politics that would be less aristocratic than old world monarchies, but still sort of be able to hold its head up on the world stage and before the American people. And then finally, at the end of the week, I discussed the so-called reign of witches in the mid and late 1790s, when the Federalists used an almost war, the quasi-war, with France to clamp down on their opposition and clamp down on their control over the government and the nation, framing their partisan actions as the protection of national security during a time of almost war, but in truth, using a quasi-war to crush their opposition and its newspapers to remain in power. And as I showed on last week, the Federalists basically pushed too far to maintain their hold on power. And 2 years later, in the next presidential election in 1800, the Federalists paid a price for that kind of overbearing politicking by losing the presidency, Jefferson wins, and really never holding significant national power ever again. Now, that kind of sounds, the way that I've just told it, it kind of sounds like a neat and tidy, happy story, right? We started with some repression, then we got democracy, yay, democracy wins. But what I want to make clear as I'm starting off today's lecture is that there wasn't a tidy pro-democratic victory in 1800. So on the one hand, yes, the more comfortable with democracy Jeffersonian Republicans won, and the more repressive, not so comfortable with democracy Federalists lost, but there was still no sweeping acceptance of all kinds of people as being equal or deserving equal rights, or even as having an equal right to engage in the political process. So there was no instant democracy. And in fact, as we're going to see today, even the rise of the person who was called the champion of the common man, Andrew Jackson, didn't mean the rise of democracy as we now define it. And that's why this week I've titled the lecture Jacksonian Democracy, because we're going to talk about what that meant and what that included and what that didn't include. So as I talk about the rise of a seemingly more democratic politics and the rise of Andrew Jackson, don't get caught up in a neat and tidy tale about the rise of democracy. Throughout most of American history, there has not been a neat and tidy pattern of straight, pure improvement over time. Things get better and worse and better and worse over time. History, this is the understatement of the year, history is complicated. Thus, people like me who have jobs explaining it. So take, for example, the story of women's rights, which over time has been more of a roller coaster ride than a straight rise to a peak. So bear all of that in mind as we turn to the champion of the common man, Andrew Jackson. Now let me say for a moment, and this is obvious, but I feel the need to say it, due diligence, that this course, offering all of American history in one semester, cannot possibly cover all of that history. So for example, I will not be talking about the War of 1812 with England that took place between 1812 and 1815. I will say in passing, and this is logical if you think about it, that winning a second war against Great Britain gave Americans a little bit of a sense of strength, a little sense that their experiment in government might actually work. So not oodles of confidence, but some confidence, a little bit of a cocky attitude. And political cartoons that came out at that time show this new kind of cocky attitude among Americans. And that's why I pulled that cartoon that's wonderfully framed by those columns. It's an 1813 cartoon in which Brother Jonathan, who's on the right, and he often stands in for Americans in cartoons. So Brother Jonathan the American is forcing an older and fatter John Bull, who's a caricature of the quintessential Englishman fond of food and drink. So the American is forcing John Bull to drink some Perry, which is a reference to Oliver Hazard Perry, America's premier naval commander during the War of 1812. So you can see a little American attitude there, right? And if you think back, I didn't show these images, but you can really easily find images, Google them, that are the precise opposite during the Revolution, of the British literally pouring things down the throats of Americans. So it's really a switch, a notable switch in how Americans are feeling. So I'm not going to delve into the War of 1812, but I will start by discussing someone who rose to fame at the end of the War of 1812 in 1815, to be precise, in the Battle of New Orleans, and that's Andrew Jackson. Now, General Andrew Jackson, who was in his 40s at the time, defeated the British in a massive victory against tremendous odds that left thousands of British soldiers dead and relatively few American casualties. And in the process, not surprisingly, Jackson made himself a hero. There were songs about Andrew Jackson, there was poetry about Andrew Jackson. He became something of a folk hero because of the Battle of New Orleans. There's even a song, like a modern song. Again, Google it all over the place. You'll find all kinds of weird culture from this moment. And I think there's a modern rendition of the Battle of New Orleans. At any rate, I offer that for your future searching online. Now, the fact that he becomes kind of a folk hero is going to end up serving him really well in 1824 and 1828 when he ran for president. Now, in 1824, Jackson was really a new kind of presidential candidate, seemingly a new kind of politician for a new generation. And you're going to hear, actually, once or twice in today's lecture, the sort of weirdness. We think of the founders as a generation and then what came next as another generation. But generations overlap. So sometimes people who you don't think should be operating within range of each other actually are. I'll come back to that momentarily. So in 1824, Jackson's a new kind of presidential candidate, seemingly a new kind of politician for this new generation. So what was so different about Jackson? Well, for one thing, he was a political outsider who claimed that he would fight insider corruption. Compared to others who were running in the 1824 election, and that includes people like John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts and Henry Clay of Kentucky, Jackson had few qualifications as a statesman. He had a brief, rather undistinguished time in Congress, and he was a territorial government. Basically, all of the presidents before him had at least some administrative or diplomatic experience. Jackson had never held a cabinet post. Jackson had never been abroad. Jackson spoke no foreign languages. Jackson didn't even write English all that well. So for all of these, you should, again, I'm going to be all full of things that you can easily Google. His misspellings are wild. For all of these reasons, high-ranking politicos really didn't take Jackson very seriously as a candidate. Now, what else was different about Jackson? Well, he was advertised as a man of the frontier, the first of his kind to run. He was also a military hero. As I just suggested, he was not formally educated. And he was also a man of strong passions, as they would have put it in the 19th century, who had no problem displaying those passions. He even sometimes used them for political effect, seeming to rage out of control to get his way, and then pulling it right back in when he got his way. Now here's one of those overlapping generation moments. Thomas Jefferson, in his old age, had this to say about the idea of Andrew Jackson becoming president. Jefferson said, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has very little respect for laws or constitutions, and his passions are terrible. When I was president of the Senate, as vice president, he was a senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly and as often choke with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man." So for all of those reasons, Jackson's kind of a new kind of presidential candidate, and his presidential campaign strategy really used that fact. To differentiate Jackson from the very established politician John Quincy Adams, for example, Jackson's supporters depicted Adams as an effete intellectual, whereas Jackson was a warrior. So in other words, literally, people were urged to vote for the man who can fight, not the man who writes. The election of 1824 was America's first out-and-out anti-intellectual presidential campaign. Now, in 1824, all of these factors won Jackson the popular vote, despite very long odds. Given that, 4 years later in 1828, he won the presidency. But it's important to note, Jackson didn't do all of his campaigning alone. Key in both elections was the hard work of New Yorker Martin Van Buren. He doesn't often get much time in the light, but Martin Van Buren's going to have 2 minutes here. Van Buren's work, in particular, shows a lot about the changing ethos of the period and its politics. Really, Van Buren's politicking shows how the nature of politicking was fundamentally changing in this time period. Now, Van Buren was actually a tavern keeper's son who rose to become president of the United States after Andrew Jackson. And he accomplished that rise to power largely based on his really acute political sensibilities. So what did he do? First, within New York State, he created an organized party organization, which is not what we've seen before. I'm going to come right back to that. Organized and networked in a way that really was new. Then he turned to the national stage with the same idea. He worked with other similarly minded politicos to create some kind of a disciplined, networked national organization to unite what ultimately becomes the Jacksonian Democratic Party and to bring them to victory. So ultimately, the rise of what we now call the second party system was helped along in a major way by Martin Van Buren's ideas and actions. And you can see why at the time he had nicknames like the Little Magician and the Sly Fox, because people were looking at what he was doing and thinking, wow, this is kind of different, and it seems to work really well. Now, to give you a sense of what party organization could really mean, I want to have you think for a moment about Thomas Jefferson just before the election of 1800. So Jefferson has a pamphlet that he really wants to get out to people, that he thinks will inform them about the coming election. And when you read his letters, he doesn't know how to do this. He's like, well, who do I contact? Well, how do I spread it? Well, who will carry it? Well, how will I reach people? And all of those things are part of what a network put in place can solve. So Martin Van Buren's sort of instigated party system made that kind of political strategy a lot easier to do. It was kind of already in place. And another factor about a party system or political parties is one concrete benefit of that was creating a real organization that people involved in it experienced as almost a club. I'm joining a club. The person who was at the center of my most recent book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, is a congressional clerk named Benjamin Brown French. And in the 1830s, he gets swept up into the Jacksonian Democratic Party. And when you read his diary, you can see how overwhelming an experience this was for him in a good way. It's like he felt like he belonged, there was an organization and he knew how to rise in it. He spent most of his time with people who were cheering for Jackson, promoting Jackson, and he fell right in with doing the same. The emotion of it is all over his diary pages. He's just overflowing with excitement at this new kind of organization, this public-minded, focused on Jackson and the nation. It was something he hadn't experienced before. And there's a great account he has in there, early on in his time of siding with the Jacksonians, in which he describes watching Jackson ride into town, whatever town he was in at the time. Jackson's in a carriage, and he says he saw the carriage come into town, and Jackson's shock of white hair was visible, even from far away, and he said there were thousands of people, so many people cheering Jackson that he says something like Jackson could have walked over their heads and made his way across the entire crowd. It was something that French had never seen before. This was a different kind of politics. So Jackson and Martin Van Buren pushed American politics towards really encompassing a party system. Now, cast your minds back to last week when I talked about how, to people in the 1790s, political parties were really a sign that something had gone drastically wrong. That parties were proof that people were focused on their own interests and not on the general good. Obviously, we are really on new terrain now. Martin Van Buren, later in life, actually wrote a pamphlet insisting that political parties were good on several counts. He wrote it in 1867 when he went into retirement, and his pamphlet was titled Inquiry into the Origin and Course of Political Parties in the United States, a good 19th century title. His argument, and it's a really interesting one, was that because national parties crossed sectional lines, given the ongoing problem of slavery, given the Civil War, national political parties were particularly important in the American Republic because they could hold the Union together. Now, once again, I'm not saying here that in the 1820s the nation suddenly jumped on a party bandwagon and never looked back, so I am describing national politics becoming more structured, but it's not yet structured and organized and disciplined in the way that we assume parties should be today. Van Buren's ideas about parties and structure and discipline took a while to spread. So, for example, the opponents to the Jacksonian Democrats, who ultimately called themselves the Whig Party, but started out calling themselves anti-Jacksonians, which is pretty clear, they didn't initially adopt party politics full force. Nor did the candidate who won in 1824, John Quincy Adams. So Adams won the election of 1824, but like his father before him, he was not interested in negotiating with parties or factions. In fact, he really didn't see himself as a party man at all. And he said as much in his inaugural address, so he really means it. He said basically that party divisions are all the fault of foreign affairs. And now that the nation was at peace, quote, this baneful weed of party strife will be uprooted. So along those lines, Adams's policies and Adams' appointments sometimes favored his supporters, sometimes favored his enemies as he saw fit, which is a nice idea in theory. But for John Quincy Adams, the end result was that in the end, he had very little political support at all. So it should come as no surprise that Adams, just like his father before him, who had similar ideas, ended up being a one-term president. The only two one-term presidents in this period are both Adamses, which says something about being an Adams. Okay. The campaign of 1828 that won Jackson the presidency had a new kind of logic. They held public rallies, they stressed their message in any way that they could, and their message was really clear. Jackson was advertised as a man of the people. A man like Adams was an aristocrat, and in this increasingly democratic age, nobody wanted to be branded an aristocrat. It was the seeming man of the people who would be most popular, and Jackson was a new kind of man of the people. So his message emphasized all of these things: his man of the people status, the fact that he was just like them, that he was an outsider, but he wasn't ambitious, that his main concern was the rights of the people and not himself. So Jackson himself and his electioneering materials spoke directly to the people with this message, emphasizing their rights and their virtues and attacking the corrupt insiders who were in charge of the government. Jackson also, when he was running, did not propound any policies, really, at all. Instead, he talked mainly about the principle of popular control of the government by the American people. So, for example, Jacksonian Democrats in 1828 drew up a resolution arguing, quote, resolved that the cause of Jackson is emphatically the cause of the people, that the contest in which we are engaged is between the people on the one side and the aristocracy on the other. That was the way they pitched that race. Jackson's common man message proved to be incredibly attractive, in part because it was really extremely vague. Yay, common man is not a lot of promises attached to that. Jackson also claimed he didn't want high office. He would only take it if the American people gave it to him. It was up to the political morality of the American people to defeat what he called the intrigues of designing demagogues. You can really sense yet another trend in American politics that has its roots here, which is this idea that we distrust our leaders and perpetually vote for supposed outsiders who are going to fight corruption. That happens a lot. This happened here. With Jackson avoiding discussion of policy, the campaign ended up being extremely personal and nasty. Adams's supporters charged Jackson with being a savage duelist, and he was a duelist, a murderer, and he did kill people in duels. And I should say, I have seen Andrew Jackson's dueling pistols at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. There's a storage room there that's like historic guns. It's huge. And I wanted to see Jackson's dueling pistols as someone who studies dueling. Most sets of dueling pistols in this period are ornate, and they have like pearl handles and carving, because the idea is you might use them once and ideally never use them at all. Jackson's were like death weapons. Like, Jackson's aren't ornate, they aren't pretty, they're just like guns. So they seemed like what I would assume Andrew Jackson would own. So he's pitched as this guy who's a murderer and a duelist. Adams' supporters also charged his wife of, sort of, committing sins. Jackson had married his wife Rachel a year after she separated from her previous husband, who she had been told had obtained a divorce. But he had not gotten a divorce, which means that Rachel had essentially committed adultery in joining with Jackson. Her first husband, accordingly, sued her for adultery. Now, ultimately, Jackson and Rachel, they're legally married, everything ended up being proper, but Jackson's opponents played up the scandal during the 1828 campaign, humiliating Rachel Jackson. Jackson was outraged, even more so when Rachel died a few months after the election, seemingly pushed to her death by the scandal caused by the election. So, as we're going to see, for Jackson, rage and politics went hand in hand. But in 1828, Jackson was rejoicing. He won and ended up drawing somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 people to the Capitol to witness his inauguration, cheering him wildly as the savior of the people and the savior of the virtue of the Republic. They saw him give his inaugural address and then watched him head off towards the presidential mansion. And here, perhaps, is the ultimate symbolic demonstration of how times had changed in America. Because in the past, during presidential inaugurations, a sense of respect and deference and gentility kept ordinary citizens at a distance during inaugurations, so they gathered around the presidential mansion. Celebrations went on in the inside among the more elite. But Jackson, as he had said over and over again, he was one of the people. And the crowd of thousands believed it. So they surged right into the presidential mansion to join him in celebrating. China and crystal crashed to the floor as people rushed to the punch bowl. People were climbing in through the windows. Silk upholstery was shredded as people with boots jumped up on furniture to get a look at Jackson. The only way that the crowd was ultimately convinced to leave the presidential mansion was when refreshments were carried out onto the lawn, and the people followed the refreshments. Now, obviously, this is a really new spirit of governance. Part of that new spirit had to do with Jackson's supposed fight against privilege. In a way, much of what Jackson did as president was about fighting big business elitists. His anti-privilege actions were always pitched as pro-democracy, anti-elitist, I'm all for you, the people. But as we're about to see, they privileged him and his supporters, and white men generally, as well. So one example of his self-serving fight against privilege has to do with his support of rotation in office. So Jackson faced a really interesting situation when he became president. Since 1800, the same party had been controlling the government, the Jeffersonian Republicans. This left Jackson with a problem. For 28 years, Republicans had filled government jobs with thousands and thousands of civil servants. To Jackson, these were people whose loyalty he could not necessarily trust, and thus, as he reasoned it, they were unfit for office. So Jackson decided to institute regular rotation in office for federal officials. For many jobs, he announced that the post would only last for 4 years, after which people would have to go back to earning a living with everybody else. Now, it's important to say Jackson did not invent the idea of rotation in office, nor was he unusually thorough, but his justification was different, and in argument, at least, more democratic. He argued that government jobs were so plain and so simple that any intelligent man could perform them, and, he argued, by moving civil servants into and out of office at will, he was preventing the emergence of an elite bureaucracy that operated beyond the will of the American people. So that's the argument, consistent, fighting privilege. But it's important to note that there was more to this idea of rotation in office, because rotation in office obviously opened up a lot of federal jobs that Jackson could give to friends and Democratic Party members as rewards for their loyalty, advancing the Democrats' hold on political power in the process. So in a sense, Jackson's war on privilege was using rotation in office to privilege people from his own party. And this whole process comes to be known as the spoils system. To the winner goes the spoils, and so you win an election and you get everything. The spoils system extended even to the highest levels of government. Jackson selected many cabinet members based less on their experience than on their political and personal loyalty, and the fact that their appointment satisfied various constituencies or supporters. So in Jackson's war against privilege, rotation in office was one alleged blow at privilege, which thereby privileged him and his loyal supporters as well. Now, of course, as suggested by what I just said, Jackson didn't have very many qualms about privileging himself or his will. He was never shy about deploying presidential power. Let's put up the second slide. Here we go. Okay. For example, he was rather strong-handed regarding the Supreme Court, to put it nicely. He put his own authority above that of the court. So, for example, there was a Supreme Court decision in 1832, the case of Worcester versus Georgia, that ruled against the state of Georgia's attempt to apply state laws to Cherokee lands. The Supreme Court ruled that against Georgia's authority to do this, essentially protecting Cherokee land. Jackson just refused to enforce the ruling. Jackson's views regarding Native Americans, which we're about to come to in more detail, also challenged the law. Treaties were considered to be legal agreements between sovereign nations. Jackson refused to believe that Native American tribes were sovereign and thus saw no validity to Indian treaties. And we'll see momentarily the result of that. Jackson seemingly disregarded precedent and the Supreme Court regarding a national bank. Now, Jackson really, really hated the Bank of the United States as a tool of privilege and corruption. And indeed, there was privilege involved in it. But Jackson made destroying the bank in the name of the American people a rallying point, denouncing it as what he called a monster, a, quote, hydra of corruption. They have a real way with language in the 18th and 19th century. It's always fun to quote. It was a hydra of corruption that used its power to subvert the democratic process and hinder the will of the people. In a way, to Jackson, the Bank of the United States virtually embodied privilege. And I can't resist adding at this point a story about Andrew Jackson and the bank, because it shows how much he really, really, really hated the bank and how the mere idea of it riled him up. And this actually comes from the middle of the memoirs of Alexander's son, James Hamilton. This is one of those generational things again. Hamilton's son, James Hamilton, became Jackson's acting Secretary of State. To me, in my mind, it's like, how are they on the stage together? But he did. So James Hamilton writes in his memoir that at one point he's with Jackson, and Jackson is ranting against the bank and got himself all riled up, or as James Hamilton put it, very excited. And then Jackson said, to Hamilton's, quote, great astonishment, that, quote, your father was not in favor of the Bank of the United States. Hamilton created the Bank of the United States. So James writes in his memoir that I was confounded and at a loss what to say and said nothing. That's bonkers, right? Your father, who founded the bank, really hated banks. Jackson had gotten himself so riled up, that made perfect sense. Yet one other Hamiltonian side note that I can't help offering. I obviously, in my life, have studied Hamilton so long. I have so many Hamiltonian side notes, but this one directly concerns the bank. So who do you suppose were at the center of part of the bank controversy with Jackson. Two of Hamilton's sons, which again is kind of appropriate given that Hamilton created the first bank. So on the one hand, you've got James Hamilton, Andrew Jackson's acting Secretary of State. On the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton Jr., who was a close friend of National Bank President Nicholas Biddle. So in late 1829, Alexander Hamilton Jr. wrote to Biddle that he'd heard that Andrew Jackson was going to come down hard on the bank in his next congressional message. He was going to say he didn't want the bank's charter renewed. You gotta guess where he heard that. Biddle wouldn't believe it. Quote, "The rumor to which you allude I have not heard from any other quarter, and I believe it is entirely without foundation," he replied. He had just met with the president, he said. The president hadn't said anything like this. So when Biddle put the bank up to be rechartered in 1832 and Congress passed the rechartering bill, Jackson vetoed it, along the lines of what Hamilton's son had suggested, writing a veto message that declared the bank unconstitutional, regardless of Supreme Court precedent, and stating his political, social, and economic reasons for his veto. In the process, he propounded the idea that a president could veto a bill they disagree with, even if it was constitutional. In essence, Jackson denied the bank's constitutionality and affirmed his right to judge that question independent of Congress or the Supreme Court. Jackson's extreme deployment of executive power extended to a personal dimension as well. I discovered this little incident when I was working on my last book. In 1832, angry at two congressmen who opposed his policies, Jackson announced to a room full of people with him in the White House that those two opposing congressmen needed to be, quote, Houstonized. He made up a word. What he was referring to was an incident that had happened a few years past when Jackson supporter and friend Sam Houston had violently caned a Jackson critic to the ground on a public street. So by announcing to a room full of people that someone needed to Houstonize two political opponents, Jackson was virtually asking someone to assault them. And everyone got the message, including those two congressmen who promptly armed themselves. So Andrew Jackson was a man who liked to deploy executive power. As someone at the time put it, a critic, Jackson seemed to want to make the entire government subject to one responsibility, one discretion, one will. So for all of these reasons, his opponents sometimes denounced him as King Andrew, and this dates to the time when Jackson is president. And I can't tell how much you can see from out there, but King Andrew is standing on a tattered, torn-up copy of the Constitution, and I'm sure you can't see it, but the book on the ground in front of him is titled Judiciary of the United States. So Jackson's opponents are making a very strong statement. And now this brings us to one particularly notorious example of excessive executive power under Jackson, the forceful removal of Native Americans from their homes. Even before Jackson was president, his support for that idea was clear. When he had military command in the South in 1817, he said, "I have long viewed treaties with the Indians an absurdity not to be reconciled to the principles of our government. The Indians are subjects of the United States, inhabiting its territory and acknowledging its sovereignty. Then is it not absurd for the sovereign to negotiate by treaty with the subject?" Clearly, Jackson had no problem with the idea of removing Native Americans from their lands and pushing them west of the Mississippi. He claimed that the United States had ultimate control of those lands, and he claimed, dubiously, that he was protecting Native Americans by moving them. Now, of course, what he didn't claim as readily was what was at the heart of his actions, and that was his interest in opening more Western lands to white American settlers. So Jackson is serving the interests and rights of white men. Along these lines, at Jackson's urging, in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, appropriating the funds necessary to purchase all of the lands held by Indian tribes east of the Mississippi River and to pay for their resettlement in the West. So the Indian Removal Act basically funded the forced relocation of Native Americans to the West. It also gave the president the power to force tribes to relocate. And not surprisingly, given everything that I've said, it didn't take Jackson long to implement his new authority. In 1831, when some white farmers penetrated Choctaw territory, the Jackson administration authorized federal troops to forcibly move the entire tribe of more than 1,000 men, women, and children across the Mississippi. The following year, the tribe went back to their own land, and federal and state military forces responded by attacking them, killing scores of people. The same thing happened in the Deep South. So, for example, look at the Cherokee. They emerged from the War of 1812 with their land relatively intact, and a new generation of leaders pushed strongly for the tribe to embrace becoming members of the American nation. So in the early 1820s, the Cherokee created a formal government with a bicameral legislature and a court system. In 1827, they declared themselves an independent republic and drafted and ratified a written constitution modeled on the US Constitution. The following year, the Cherokee began publishing their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. But rather than winning praise from their white neighbors, such innovations led to even greater friction. To frontiersmen, Native Americans were supposed to be dying out and disappearing, not founding new governments and thriving. Interestingly, Thomas Jefferson used the same logic about Native Americans during his lifetime and when he was president. He assumed that Native Americans would ultimately merge with Americans and vanish in one way or another. And if they didn't, well, then that wouldn't be good for them. To many of these white settlers in the South, as to Jackson and any number of government authorities, Native Americans had no inherent rights to specific lands. So when gold was found on Cherokee land in Georgia and thousands of prospectors swarmed in, the Georgia legislature extended its law over the Cherokee territory, nullifying Cherokee laws. And when the Cherokee sought help from nearby federal troops, Jackson withdrew the troops, asserting that this was a state matter, not a federal matter. From this point on, the Georgia legislature did everything that it could to force the Cherokee to leave the state. And eventually, tribal unity broke down and a faction emerged that supported relocation. Obviously, the federal government was more than happy to meet with this minority faction, and they maneuvered the sale of Cherokee land to the federal government. Although the Cherokee continued to fight in court and lobby in Congress for their land, in 1838, federal troops rounded up the entire Cherokee people, roughly 18,000 people, and forcibly removed them from their lands. Their trek to their new territory, now in the state of Oklahoma, later became known as the Trail of Tears. Due to poor provisions and a lack of supplies, joined with a particularly cold winter, nearly a quarter of the people who started on that journey died on the way. So white settlers, and in a way the United States as an expanding nation, essentially gained privilege at the expense of the lives and welfare of Native Americans. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, it certainly tells us a lot about Jackson's times. So first, it clearly shows that this was a violent age in which violent white men could do very well in politics when their behavior was framed the right way. To a certain degree, people voted for fighters, and I found this in my most recent book, The Field of Blood, about violence in Congress, particularly in the South, If you were a congressman from the South and you were armed or you threatened people with fists, you tended to get reelected because you were literally fighting for your constituents. So violence, in some ways, is really incorporated even into formal politics in this period. Okay, so first, you can see what a violent age this is and how violence incorporated its way into everything. Second, this look at Jackson reminds us that the idea of democracy is fraught with contradictions. The rise of interest in the common man was linked with the killing of Native Americans and aggressively pushing them off their land. Jacksonian democracy brought with it Indian genocide and the promotion of slavery. In American history, not just here, but very often throughout American history, rights for some often do not mean rights for all. Third, this portrait of Andrew Jackson reminds us that national expansion was not a grand tale of manifest destiny. There were costs, big costs, bloody costs. So what we've seen today, amidst all of these contradictions, is how in some ways Jackson was truly a representative of a new generation of politicians and of politics. A promoter of a channeled, limited democratic politics grounded on the suppression or killing of many. In that sense, and more, Jackson was a true representative of the contradictions, long-standing contradictions that are and have always been inherent in the evolution of American democracy. Now, Thursday is my last lecture. Oh, that's very nice of you. I can't quite believe I've made it through all of those lectures, but Thursday is my last lecture. And I'm going to be talking about some of the ways in which the United States was, and its people were dramatically changing in this period. I can't remember the precise title, but I think it talks about protest and reform. So I'm going to be talking about some of the ways in which people were standing up and demanding rights. I'm going to talk about some of the dramatic changes in that period as well, like manufacturing and the market revolution, the industrial revolution, and things like the telegraph that fundamentally changed a lot of things. So in a way, my last lecture is going to be a sort of glance at where we've landed, and I will then turn things over to my wonderful colleague, David Blight, who the week after will pick up where I left off. So I'll see you guys on Thursday.